All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And we are here to study Talmud. And we were, of course, just talking about Scholar in Residence Weekend in 2 weeks or a week and a half or whenever that is, 2.5 weeks. And we are going to dig into a piece of text in a Masechet called Chulin. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Chulin, but it's going to be a sort of a distraction because we're not actually going to learn about any of the subject of Chulin. Chulin is all about meat and slaughter, which is to say, it's about how do we take an animal and slaughter it in a kosher way and then eat it. Of course, it has other things in there, and the context that that sort of brings us to our subject, which is going to be Jacob's ladder and associated stories. Oh, I'm going to sneeze. Hold on one sec. I'm going to mute myself. Nope, not going to happen. The reason we get into the subject of Jacob's ladder, which is what we're going to talk about today, is because they're talking about Jacob wrestling with the angel, which technically happens next week's parsha. That's fine. And the reason why is they talk about the sciatic nerve, the gida nashe, which is something that is not edible according to kashrut. And so the whole discussion is about the gida nashe and the wrestling that Jacob does with the angel and the sciatic nerve, right? And sort of how those things intersect. And so in the conversation about the sciatic nerve, we get a sort of a discussion about Jacob's ladder and the circumstances. Does anybody have any questions about what I said so far?
Yeah, I have, it's more like a comment, but the people from North Africa, that region, they are able to extract that nerve so that they do eat that kind of meat.
Yeah, so let me make a slight distinction, which is it's common custom in the Ashkenazi world to only eat the front half of a large animal, mostly due to effort. Like, not because that they can't, it's just not worth the energy. It's much better just to sell the back half to a non-Jewish person, let them eat it. In the Sephardic world, that effort is undertaken. And so certainly North Africa is an example. In Mizrahi and in the Sephardic world, that effort is just, it's not that it can't be done, but it's just that effort. It's not like a separate set of halachic rules for Ashkenazi and Sephardim, which is true in other places. It's just about who's willing to put in the time and the effort to carve out the
rabbi who I know from that area told me they didn't I think they couldn't get rid of the rest of the meat. It was a question of finances.
Yeah, I mean, so much of Jewish law, certainly when it comes to the ancient world and differently, it functions differently in the more modern world, talks about the sort of economy of scarcity, right? The rabbis didn't have 3 sets of dishes. They had to deal with what they had because that's what they had. We live in a world of true abundance. And so we have not a different set of rules, but we engage with those rules very differently. Bob, and then Karen.
If you Google for kosher fillet, you can find it. There's somebody, I think in California, who is supposedly filleting out that nerve. And I don't know how accepted the kosher is and by whom, but it's, quote, kosher fillet is available.
Yeah, again, it's not like it can't be done. When I studied the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem, I remember in a kashrut class, we watched a video of somebody removing the sciatic nerve, the gida nashe, and it was quite fascinating. Karen, and then we're not actually going to be talking about this, but I'm happy for the detour. That's all right, Karen, go for it.
I was just going to say, in fancy meat restaurants in Israel, you can get a fillet. That's like an expensive, fancy thing you can do there. So
right, and now you know why it's expensive,
yeah.
Right? Because you have to put in all this extra effort as opposed to just lopping off the back end and figuring out for somebody else. Okay, let's jump into our text. And the context is, excuse me, can everybody see this? Yes, thumbs up? Yeah, okay, great. The context of our discussion is about Jacob and the wrestling. We take a brief detour, and I don't want to sort of get too lost in what we were talking about before, but I do want to read this one line, which is sort of a great transition, which is, it says there, and I'm just going to read it. Rav said that the source is from here, and they're debating about a particular source, that the sun rose for him as he, this is Jacob, passed over Peniel, and he limped upon his thigh, right? So we're talking, this is again, next week's Parsha, the first chapter of next week's Parsha. This indicates that Jacob remained where he was all night and left in the morning because a Torah scholar would not go out alone at night. The whole discussion that they're having right before this, which is not what we're talking about tonight, is sort of the circumstances in which Jacob finds himself wrestling with an angel. And the argument they're having is whether or not a Torah scholar, who Jacob clearly was, as we had talked about a few weeks ago, about our ancestors being yeshiva students, that a Torah scholar would not go out at night and uses biblical sources to prove it. Because a Torah scholar would not go out at night and find themselves wrestling with a stranger, right? That's the argument being made. But here's the interesting part. Oh yeah, Ron, before we move forward.
This really, it doesn't have anything to do with what you're talking about, except that you brought up his limping. The location of where he saw the ladder when he was going to Haran, and the location where he was wrestling with the angel coming back, was it the same place? Is there anything talked about whether it's the same place or different places?
I'm sure the answer is knowable. I don't know it off the top of my head. So it's a great question. I just, off the top of my head, I don't know the answer. And so I don't want to give you one way or another without knowing for sure. But seems like a very knowable thing. So between this week and next week, hopefully I'll be able to answer that question. Okay. So Rav, in this whole discussion about Jacob and wrestling and Torah scholars at night, uses this quote from the beginning of next week's Parsha. The sun rose for him as he passed over Peniel, and he limped upon his thigh. Now, like as Ron was intimating, I want us to place ourselves in the mind of Jacob finding himself in Haran, or having left Haran, and is now in the wilderness, with Jacob's ladder. That's the story. That's where I want our mind to be. Can I get a volunteer to read for us this paragraph here where the Gemara cites? Anybody want to read for us? Karen, is that you volunteering or no?
It wasn't me, but I'll read.
Okay.
Okay.
Sheila, I'll go to you next.
Okay. The Gemara cites an incident involving the final verse cited above. Rabbi Akiva says, I asked the following question of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua in the meat market of the town Emmaus, where they went to purchase an animal for the wedding feast of Rabban Gamliel's son. It is written in the verse, and the sun shone for him when he passed Peniel, and he limped upon his thigh. But did the sun shine only for him? Didn't it shine for the entire world?
Awesome. Okay, so a couple of things I want to unpack here. First of all, let's start with the end, which is they're asking this question where this is such a close reading of the text, right? The sun rose for him, and you can see the text right here, right? Vayizrach lo hashemesh, right? And it could have said Vayizrach hashemesh, the sun rose, but it didn't say that. It said Vayizrach lo. And so we have this close reading of the text asking this question. Okay. And reasonably, we might ask, again, reasonably in our sort of magical thinking here, we might ask, did the sun only rise for Jacob or did it shine for everybody? Now, let's just step back and talk about the context. This is what we get, like this peek into what the rabbi's life was really like, which was they were like going on errands and doing stuff. They weren't just sitting in the Beit Midrash. They had like lives and interactions and families, and they were interacting with each other. And I love this image of Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Akiva walking around at the market to buy meat for Rabban Gamliel's son for their wedding, and asking this like sort of esoteric question, like in between the stalls, like, hey, by the way, I got this question about a verse. You guys have the answer? I just, the image I think is just glorious. It gives us
I don't want to interrupt, but if Rabbi Akiva was there, Rabbi Gamliel was there, Rabbi Yehoshua was there, that's because they were the mobile Beit Din.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly tells us about like that these people spent time together. It told us, like, not just that, but these are important figures for us, and that they spent, they really in some ways are kind of like a mobile Beit Din. The world, of course, worked very differently then, but that's fine. Okay, all right, Sheila, I'm gonna volunteer you. Here is not the answer from Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua, but from Rabbi Yitzchak. And this part speaks to, Ron, your question in some level in terms of the geography. All right, Sheila, go for it. Rabbi Yitzchak says.
Rabbi Yitzchak says, the verse means that the sun, which set early exclusively for him, also shone early exclusively for him in order to rectify the disparity created by the premature sunset. The Gemara explains, when the sun set early for him, as it is written, and Jacob went from Beersheba and went toward Haran.
That's from this week's Parsha.
And it is written thereafter, and he encountered the place and he slept there because the sun had set. When Jacob arrived at Haran, he said, is it possible that I passed a place where my fathers prayed and I didn't pray there? When he set his mind to return, I'm sorry, I don't know how to get it off.
Okay.
When he set his mind to return, the land contracted for him. Immediately the verse states, and he encountered the place, indicating he arrived there miraculously.
Okay, amazing, Sheila. All right. The rabbis are discussing really tremendous circumstances that are happening for Jacob. And like we spoke about a few weeks ago, the question is not whether or not this is historically or scientifically accurate. It's about placing ourselves in the minds of the rabbis and trying to understand why they are making the claims they make. So here, Rabbi Yitzchak answers the question, did the sun only shine for Jacob? Didn't it shine for everyone? We get the first part of the answer. Rabbi Yitzchak says it's the sun which set, right? The sun was trying to make a recompense for having gone to a premature sunset. And so then we have to ask ourselves, what premature sunset? We have this verse, and Jacob went out from Beersheba and went towards Haran, and it was written right after that, the next verse, and he encountered the place. And I want to point out, by the way, that the Gemara doesn't quote everything, right? The non-bold is Rabbi Steinsaltz helping us out here by giving us the full verse. The rabbis don't always quote the part of the verse that they find is interesting. They just quote the part that they think is going to remind people. Okay, so we have Jacob went out from Beersheba and went to Haran, and he encountered the place, and he slept there because the sun had set. And so what the rabbis are understanding, what they understand is we have a geography problem. Because he left Beersheba, and the phrase would seem to tell us that he arrived at Haran, but he didn't arrive at Haran, he was somewhere in the middle. And so they tell the story to resolve this, that Jacob arrived at Haran, realized that he had missed a spiritual opportunity, turned around, wanted to turn around and go back. And then this miracle happened by the land, sort of like in a wormhole, shrinks so that he can show up and pray there. And therefore, because he didn't have to travel a long distance and it became sunset, that's the claim that the sun set early. Now, again, whether or not you agree or disagree with it notwithstanding, that's the argument being made. And so since the sunset was early, the sun rose early for him as well. That's the claim being made here. All right, Sheila, I know that you this drives you crazy. You want to share?
I don't understand it.
What part don't you
understand? In other words, it sounds like they're trying. they're forcing something.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah.
They're forcing, and I don't quite understand what the importance of it is.
Yeah. So
In
I
other words,
think,
why are they bothering on? This is what bothers me sometimes in the
Yeah.
Talmud, is that what's the difference where he,
so I think that it comes
what
from
are they trying to prove? What are they
Sure,
really
sure.
trying to prove? Or is this lay conversation?
Yeah, so I think it comes from the following impetus, which is, I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment, which is the following, which is that the rabbis have an axiom, if you will. Is everybody familiar with the term axiom? Yes, an axiom is sort of like a first principle, right? It sort of proves itself. It's not really. I'm not using it correctly, but you'll bear with me. A principle. Let's stick with that. A principle that every word of the Torah has to be used. It has to be understood in some way. Okay. And there are discrepancies in the sense that the text shows things that are extraneous, but they cannot be extraneous. They have to be intentional. Those principles coming together create space for the rabbis to come up with explanations to sort of make things work. And it does sort of lead to fantastical descriptions like what we're seeing here, because their priority is saying it has to work. Every word has to make sense.
But isn't that what Midrash does? Wouldn't Midrash try to explain this?
What do you think this is?
But it's in the Talmud. It's Mishnah and Gemara.
Yes. So this is an important reminder for us that Talmud is not a law book. It's in part Midrash, the verb, right? We have collections of Midrash that are edited together by later authors, but the Talmud is not free from that type of thinking. It's not a law book. It collects Midrash and interpretations and explanations and stories. It itself is a manifestation of Midrash. And so the answer is yes. This is Midrash. This is an attempt to try and make things make sense. Now, for us as moderns, we might say, this doesn't make any more sense. But for them in the ancient world, they're trying to figure it out. Thoughts? Does everybody feel like they understood the argument that we made, even if it's not one that you would make? Does everybody feel like they understand the argument Rabbi Yitzchak is making here? It's okay if not, because I want to explain it again. Yeah, Bob.
It's an interesting explanation by people who never had a remote control that had a fast forward and a fast backward.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to draw a map because I think that helps me visualize this, which is, we have this here. Can everybody see the picture, or is it too small? Let me stop here. Here's the picture, right? You have Beersheba on one side and Haran on the other, right? That's the travel that Jacob did. Except here is this special place where his ancestors prayed. And so the question is, for Jacob at that moment, does he go back to travel to that special place? And what the Midrash is suggesting is that those lines are shrinking so that he turns around, he's basically already there. He doesn't have to travel back. Again, this is not to scale. You'll stick with me for a moment, right? And so since he basically traveled immediately, right, he would have been there way too early for it to be sunset. Because you're right, at Haran, it was still day. And because the sun set early, because that's what the verse told us, that it set, we have a problem, which is that we've lost daytime. And therefore, the other verse tells us that daytime was repaired, the amount of daytime was repaired later. Again, strange argument, certainly. I don't want to get too lost in it because there are much more interesting things in this section that I want to read. Karen and then Nelson, and then we'll move on.
So the verse says that he went towards Haran. So I don't understand why he couldn't have just like slightly, he didn't make it to Haran at all. He just was like walking past the place and the sun set early and he prayed there. I don't understand why they had to say that he went to Haran and went back, because it never says he went to Haran, it says he went towards.
So I agree with you. I think that is a weakness in the argument.
Okay.
My only guess as to why, without having dug much deeper into this particular section, is that we have circumstances in the Torah when it says they went toward a place and did not describe arriving. Now, in many places they do. So again, I'm saying this with trepidation. My guess is that they, because those examples exist, we can say, oh, he arrived in Haran without ever saying he arrived in Haran. But I don't think that's a good argument. I'm not suggesting that's a good argument, but I also think they're really stretching here. I don't think Rabbi Yitzchak is making a really solid argument. I think he's really trying to bend it to make it work for him. Nelson.
I'm trying to grasp with why this whole discussion is important. I mean, not our discussion, but their discussion. They're trying to say that the place where he prayed was very important. It was so important that he would change his path to go there. And then they have a geometry problem. You know, they just have to patch up time or space so that it's quick and.
Yeah, so Rashi tells us, again, Rashi is obviously much later. Rashi tells us that there's no earlier or later in the Torah, which is to say that the Torah is not telling us things in chronological order always, sometimes, but not always. And as a result, we can know things sort of out of order. It's a bad explanation, you'll bear with me. We know, right, that God was in that place, right? And Jacob didn't know, right? He says that when he wakes up in the morning after seeing the angels, God was here and I did not know it, right? And so we know that he has to end up there somehow because this is a holy place and it's where his Isaac and Abraham had been before. And so they want him to end up in this place and they're trying to make sure that he gets there. Again, that is in the sense that we know what's going to happen before it happens. I know that may not be super satisfying, Nelson. All right, let's keep going because I actually think there are really interesting things that happen in this. Again, I want us to sort of be in this fantastic place, right? I want us to think about how the rules are bending here and what that might mean for us at the end. Can I get another volunteer here to read this short little section? When he finished praying. Okay. When he finished praying and he wanted to return to Haran, the Holy One, blessed be God, said, "This righteous person came to my lodging place and will depart without remaining overnight." Immediately the sun set before its proper time so that Jacob would stay overnight in that place. Right? So now we have this circumstance. God wants to be a really good host, but God's guest, is going to leave before our opportunity to be a good host. And so God bends the rules of time and space so that the sun sets early, and so that Jacob is required to stay overnight. Now, again, does this text of the Torah say this? Absolutely not. Not remotely. But we start to get, for Rabbi Yitzchak at least, a sense of what is Jacob thinking? What is God thinking about creating this moment that we actually think is really quite powerful in our retellings as modern people, right? That we have the Jacob's ladder, and we have I was here and God was here and I did not know it, right? So we're trying to create this moment, and so we have this sort of problem. Right? This contradiction in this circumstance And we have this teaching from Rabbi Yitzchak trying to resolve it. Because the Gemara is associative. Yeah, Bob, because I was going to move on. Yeah, Bob.
If I were trying to make the explanation here, I would say that Jacob fell asleep he was tired from his travel, and he woke up and the sun had set. I would not have gone so far as to get way out in left field.
I love that. Right. He had a doze, and as a result, he wakes up. It's nighttime. God must have set the sun early. I love it. I'm willing to bet Rabbi Yitzchak has had a doze himself, and is having a circumstance like this. Is it 6 p.m. or 6 a.m. Right? I can't remember. I love it. And so we have this. Because the Gemara, the Talmud is associative. So we had this whole section about Jacob and the wrestling, and so now we have this whole circumstance of Jacob, this other story of Jacob. We had his teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak, and now we have another teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak says the following. The Gemara cites another exposition of Rabbi Yitzchak to explain an apparent contradiction between two verses pertaining to this incident. Is written in the text, and he, Jacob, took of the stones of the place and placed them under his head, and lay down in that place to sleep. Right, this is from this week's parsha. Vayikach me'avnei hamakom. Avnei is plural. I see you're wrong. I'm going to come back to you in a second. And it is written, a few verses later, and Jacob rose up early in the morning, and he took the stone, right here, et ha'even, singular stone, that he placed under his head, and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil upon the top of it. This first verse indicates that Jacob took several stones, whereas the later verse indicates that he took only one stone. Right, so that's a real textual conflict that we might all encounter. Rashi quotes this verse, this explanation. Rabbi Yitzchak says, "This teaches that all the stones gathered it to one place, and each one said, 'Let this righteous man place his head upon me.'" Right. So they were arguing about who could be slept upon, and it was taught all of them were absorbed into one large rock. Again, we're like bending the rules of science and miracles, and they're really bending all of it. Now we're starting to get a sense of what Rabbi Yitzchak is all about. All right, Ron.
I've heard, I don't know if it's a midrash. I heard the midrash before about the one stone or the multiple stones becoming one stone. And of course, I'm reading the English. I read that when it says, and he took of the stones, it doesn't say he took more than one of the stones. It says it took a stone. I mean, that's my first thing. And the second thing that always gets me about this is when he wakes up and he makes a pillar and anoints it with oil. I think to the later into the Torah where it tells you not to make a pillar and anoint it with oil. And I'm saying, yes. Why did he do that? It's totally against the rules.
Absolutely true. So let's take those things as separate for the moment. So, okay. So I'm looking at the verse itself. My sense is that placed them in the Hebrew is vayasem, and that ends up being pretty plural. And so that's how they resolved, because you're right, it says me'avnei hamakom, from the stones of the place. But I think they ultimately understand that he's taking multiple stones. But I think your challenge is a good one. All right, so I'm resolving.
I'll throw out one more thing since you just said hamakom. I mean, he took one of God's stones.
Right. Well, I mean that exactly is sort of the intimation that that this is full of godliness. Actually, the second thing you said was about stones and pillars and oil. So I think this is really important for us to remember. When we talk about our existence as Jews, we are. Can you hear me? Can people hear me? Yes, okay. We need to remember that we are rabbinic Jews, in the sense that we follow a rabbinic tradition as distinct from the Israelite religion as described in the Torah and in the Tanakh. Or like, we're not exactly, we claim them as our ancestors, but that the religion, the ways we do our religion look different. And so I think, Ron, what you're pointing out is that there are things that existed in Israelite religion and even early Judaism and Temple Judaism that we would never do today as a result of our rabbinic inclinations. And so you're right in the sense that taking a stone, setting it up, and pouring oil on it doesn't feel very Jewish.
I wasn't even talking about that. I'm saying later in the Torah, it says not to do that.
Right.
Jacob also married sisters, which the Torah says not to do.
Yeah, so I think part of that is, I think we talked about this 2 weeks ago. One argument to resolve that is what's called the documentary hypothesis. Are people familiar with the documentary hypothesis? Yes, no? In brief, the premise is that there were 4 authors, each writing parts of this text that were edited together by a redactor, J, E, P, and D, each representing sort of a different trend, a different telling of this story. And we see contradictions between them, and I think what you're pointing to is one of them. I'll give you a classic example, which is in the P, which is the priestly author. We talk about going to your local priest, paying them, doing the offering at the local high place. But in D, the Deuteronomist, they say, do not go to your high places, go to the central place in Jerusalem, or the center place of where the Mishkan is. That's a conflict. And so we have different ways of approaching when texts seem to be in contradiction. And I think this goes to speak to how Talmud functions more broadly, which is the rabbinic tradition says the following. We have 2 things that seem to be in contradiction, but they're not allowed to be. And I'll give you an example of how this works, right? So we have this verse, these 2 verses here that seem to be in contradiction. So the Talmud or the Mishnah or whatever says, no, they're not allowed. They're both equally true. They're actually talking about different cases. And this happens in more halakhic examples than this one, which is we have this rule, right? This Mishnah and that Mishnah seem to be in conflict. No, the Talmud says they're talking about different cases. Then the Tosafot come and say, we've got this section of Talmud and that section of Talmud that seem to be in conflict, but they're not allowed to be. So they must be talking about different cases. This trend happens over and over and over again until the modern age, where we still do this, where we say, no, we have 2 things that seem to be conflict, they're not allowed to, so we resolve them. By the way, I think that's part of why Judaism continues to be innovative, which is we refuse to say this doesn't have truth in it. Now, truth doesn't mean we agree with it. I'm talking about sort of capital T, big ideas, truth. We have things that have truth in it, and we have to deal with it. We have to find a way of syncing all of those things out. All right, let's keep going, and then maybe at the end we'll talk about why we think all of these fantastic things are happening. Does anybody want to read this one? Okay. The Gemara expounds other verses pertaining to the same incident. The verse states, and he, Jacob, dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. So this is the dream that he was having. I love this part. This is so crazy. It was taught, how wide was the ladder? It was 8,000 parsot, wide. As it is written, behold the angels of God ascending and descending on it. Okay, so we have a problem here, right? We have a question of how wide it is. It's 8,000 parsangs, and our proof text is, behold the angels of God ascending and descending on it, right? So we've got angels, plural. Here's how they break it down. The word ascending, olim, is written in plural, which indicates there are 2 angels ascending simultaneously. Okay, we got 2 here. Likewise, we have the term descending, viardim, which is also plural, which means we have 2 angels which were descending simultaneously, which means we have how many? And when they met one another, right, so they're both going up and down, at one point they have to cross each other, and at that moment, in that location, there were a total of 4 in one place, so the ladder must be wide enough to accommodate 4 angels. Is everybody with the argument so far? We haven't gotten to the parseins yet. Right, so we got 2 going up, 2 going down. At some point, there's going to be 4 of them. And so it's got to be 4 angels wide. Yeah, David.
On the one hand, I suppose that they're having this discussion at all shows a great deal of interest in what could be implied intricacies of the text and therefore a love of the text. On the other hand, though, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with advancing the story one way or another to ask how wide the ladder is. Why should that even matter?
Yeah, so I think on one level, the question is, how do we understand the story better? Is one question, I think, being asked, right, by you, David. And the rabbis are interested in that. But also, we know that the rabbis are also interested in how Torah can tell us about existence. And the story doesn't, the Torah begins with the creation of the universe. It's not just story to them on some level. It's about how does universe function, right? We've got chaos and order living together, right? And that they're being resolved. We've got water and earth living together somehow. We've got lights of different types and modes, right? We're learning about the nature of the universe. And here we have an opportunity to learn about the nature of angels themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to define a term here for a moment, and then Bob and Karen, I see you. A parsing here is a unit of measurement, and the Talmud is basically considered just under 4 miles. So we're talking about 8,000 times 4 miles wide. Now we have to prove whether or not this is true. But again, they are telling us, in some sense, their worldview about how the nature of angels and the universe works. It's fantastic, and I mean that in a literal sense, right? It's absolutely wild that they would imagine it this way, or at least the particular author would imagine this way. Bob, and then Karen.
Wow. Ascending together, my understanding of the words doesn't necessarily mean side by side, number one.
True.
Number two is you're assuming the angels have mass?
Yeah.
That they're solid?
Yeah, so
that they're uniform in their shape, that even if they turn sideways, they couldn't pass? I mean, it's bizarre.
Yeah, no argument. It's definitely wild. I want to say the rabbis generally, when they see a plural, will assume 2 unless there's evidence to the contrary. The point that you're making is a good one, which is 2 doesn't mean that they're doing it simultaneously. That is a claim they are making. Karen, hold on. Karen, Nelson, Sheila, and then Ron.
So that's kind of I always envisioned that as this whole ladder full of angels going up and going down. The side by side is it never entered my mind. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, if they're going up and down and it's all the way to heaven, that's pretty tall, right? Yeah, how are they both going up back and forth, right? Or is it one angel at a time?
No, I just pictured lots of angels going up, one behind the other, and lots of angels coming down. But aren't there all these midrashim about how they went up first and then they came down, so they were already on earth? Which they
yeah,
ignored?
so we don't. I don't think there is any attempt here for the rabbis to say that every interpretation has to be true all at the same time. Sometimes, and so in this case, this claim is saying four, 2 up, 2 down simultaneously. But I think your point, I've heard the same, right? That that they came in order because it says Olim and then Yardim, right? So that's equally valid. They don't have to be true at the same time. So anyway, we're at least getting a peek into one view. Nelson, Sheila, Ron.
So the ancient Greeks, maybe 700-800 years before this, had a good approximation to the diameter of the Earth at about 25,000 miles. So this ladder is wider than the Earth. Did the rabbis know that?
They would know that level of measurement for sure.
So what was it standing on?
I think the first question is a stronger one, which is, what does it mean for the ladder to be as wide or wider than the Earth itself? Right. So that is a fascinating question. Sheila and then Ron.
Actually, we had the same thought, because that the ladder was that wide. The message is not literal, but rather it covers the whole Earth.
Yeah.
That this applies not just to his one little place where he is, but it extends to the whole Earth. God is everywhere, and and the angels are everywhere, ascending all over the Earth.
Absolutely right. Right. We're getting the omnipresence of the God, which again feeds back to what we said before, which is our term for God in this context is hamakom, the place. And again, the contradiction between a singular place and every place living simultaneously. Ron.
I'm going to go back to that statement you made about when they see plural, they assume two. So therefore, monotheism has two gods because we call them Elohim, which is plural.
I mean, the rabbis certainly deal with that question, and the rabbis, certainly ancient Israelites, did not believe that God was the only God in existence, but instead the king God, right? The God of gods, right? Melech Malachim, right? And so it's only a more modern understanding of monotheism to say, oh no, there's only one God and it's ours, as opposed to our God is the God of all gods. So I don't think that the ancient Israelites would be uncomfortable with the idea that there are many gods. I don't know off the top of my head whether or not the rabbis also believed that. My sense is that they probably did.
Well, in Jonah, they're talking about other gods.
Yeah, look, they talk about Asherah in the rest of Nach, which is sort of this god and it has tree symbolism and stuff like that. We have Baal in other places in Nach, in Nevi'im Ketuvim. So yeah, I mean, certainly the existence of other gods is not outside the Tanakh's understanding of itself. All right, let's. I just want to show the proof text that they use to talk about the width of the angel. And it was written in a verse with regard to an angel in the book of Daniel. His angel, his body was like Tarshish, the location, the city. And it is learned as a tradition, right, that Tarshish was 2,000 parsangs wide, the city. Consequently, in order to accommodate 4 angels, a ladder must have been 8,000 parsangs wide, meaning to say an angel is the size of the city, and there are 4 angels. That's how they get this measurement. Now, again, we have a much larger point being made of maybe Tarshish was just this giant city, and they're expressing its giantness in measurements. Again, the rabbis and the Tanakh itself play fast and loose with some measurements, but not others. The last thing I want us to read, and then maybe we can just sort of talk. I mean, this section is just so amazing. It's so fascinating. And then we'll talk maybe about why the rabbis might be interested in this. We have the following description. It was taught, and this we know that this is in a Baraita because it says Tana here. It was taught that the angels were ascending and gazing at the image of Jacob above, engraved on the throne of glory, and descending and gazing at his image below, right? So that there was some sort of image of Jacob being engraved in God's throne, and then looking at real Jacob on earth. The angels subsequently became jealous of Jacob and wanted to endanger his life. Immediately, Jacob received divine protection, as the verse states, and behold, the Lord stood over him. Now, the question the rabbis are trying to answer is, why would it say the Lord stood over Jacob? There has to be a good reason. Here's the reason they're given. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, known as Reish Lakish, were it not written in the verse, it would be impossible to utter it. I love this, right? This is the phrase. We see it all the time in the Gemara. Ilmale mikra katuv efshar lo omro. If the verse in the Torah hadn't said it, we would never claim it. It's too impossible to believe, right? That God stood over Jacob to protect him. Since it describes God as standing over Jacob to protect him from the angels, like a parent who waves a fan over their child to cool them down. I love this image. They see God as not only Jacob's protector, but as a parent, waving Jacob down as if he was hot, fanning him down to cool him down. I love this image in particular because it describes God in a very particular way, and it describes the relationships between angels and God in a really and humans in a very interesting, contentious way. Nelson and then David. No, Nelson? No? Oh, you had the hand up. Okay. David.
So this presupposes that we have to have consistency, which we clearly don't have to have. So maybe I'm raising a false problem. But if we've already learned from the experience of Abraham and his guests while he's recovering from his circumcision a couple of parshiot ago, that the angels have missions and that unlike us, they don't really have free choice. They're expressing on earth what God's intention is. If we read this verse the way this proposes to read it, in that light, we would have to understand that God is purposefully sending angels that might want to attack Jacob so that God can express protection of Jacob personally, so to speak. That's quite remarkable, I think, if that's valid.
I mean, it's as good of a read as any other. Yeah, I think that challenges us once again, this really complex relationship between life, protection, parenthood, and God. Right? God, again, being the same one who asks Abraham to kill his own son. We have a real complex relationship here between God and God's creations. I have no resolution to it because I think your point is well made. These relationships are not simple. We're not going to read it because we're running a little low on time, but I want to just sort of show it to you. Here, it goes a little bit further, and it says that, once again, with Rabbi Yitzchak loving to change the time-space continuum, Rabbi Yitzchak says that God folded up all of Eretz Yisrael and placed it under Jacob so that it would be easy to conquer. Right? Made it really tiny. It was easy to conquer. Crazy imagery. Then it goes with this whole conversation here about Jacob wrestling, and maybe we'll return to that next week. But it's this part that I thought was so fascinating, which is it talks about this question about the sort of the differences between humans and angels. And it says here, Rav Hananel and Rav said, 3 groups of ministering angels recite a song every day to God. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord, right? Kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. And then they say, well, no, it's actually not all of them saying it at the same time. it's one saying Kadosh, the other one saying Kadosh, and the third saying Kadosh, right? God's world is full of glory. Now again, bringing this verse into context with the fact that the ladder is all across the entire universe becomes particularly meaningful now, right? So angels claim, they sing to God every day. And then the Gemara says, well, maybe it's not every day, right? The Jewish people are more dear to God than the angels. Now we're starting to get that conflict. Because the Jewish people may recite a song of praise to God at any time, right? We can sing praises to God at any moment of our lives. But the angels only recite once per day, right? Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And some say it's a week, some say it's once a month, one says once a year, once it's every 7 years, once it's once every Jubilee, which is 50 years, and then the last one. And some say they recite a song of praise one time in the entire history of the world. And then it gets into this whole conversation about whether or not the Jewish people mention the name of God more than angels. Because the Jewish people mention God's name after 2 words, Shema Yisrael Adonai. There are 2 words before Adonai, Shema Yisrael, 2 words. But angels, they say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. That's 3 words before God's name. That's how we know that the Jewish people are more dear, or have this fascinating connection with God more than angels. And then they have this whole conversation here about, well, maybe it's only 1 word, maybe it's Kadosh each separately. Here they say, well, we have another verse from Ezekiel, blessed be the glory of the Lord from God's place. Right? Well, blessed from the glory of the Lord is 3 words. All of this is to say, and again, it's not to sort of get too deep into it, which is that this relationship between angels, God, the nature of creation, are sort of the relationship between how the universe we think should function and the way it ends up functioning, or we imagine it functioning, or God causes it to function, I think forces us to ask really fascinating questions about what the rabbis did or did not truly believe, right? Is this just great storytelling and they didn't actually believe it? Or are they making a claim about how God works in the universe? What do people think?
I think they have too much time on their hands.
Right. I would certainly say that the rabbis enjoyed this process, without a doubt.
Jeremy, can I just tell a story that I think you will appreciate, certainly?
Sure.
Susanna Heschel, Rabbi Heschel's daughter, was taught in Cleveland. She lived here for a while. And she used to like telling the story. She was 5 years old and her father took her to the circus. They lived in New York. And on their way down, they saw Rabbi Lieberman, Saul Lieberman, who was a great Talmud scholar, who had no children of his own. I mean, he was fully Talmud, he was like these rabbis. That's all he thought of. And so Heschel says to him, why don't you join me? So the 2 of them are talking Talmud during the entire circus while Susanna was enjoying herself. She couldn't get that picture out of her mind.
I love that. Yeah.
But that's what these rabbis are doing. It's exactly what they're doing.
This is the way they walk through the world, right? And so we have what to learn from them and what to remind them that maybe there's more to life. Maybe there's a circus. So, yeah, Karen.
So I think they started out trying to resolve a problem or to talk about a certain piece of Torah or something. But there's so much stream of consciousness that I just picture these people sitting there and starting with this one topic and going, that makes me think. And that's where I think a lot, of this.
And when did they do their work?
They said it.
They all are engaged in work.
Sorry, go on, finish, Karen.
No, Sheila's got a good question.
Well,
because they all worked.
So I think I think, Karen, you're exactly right, which is this stream of consciousness. At least the Gemara is being edited this way for us to understand it that way, right? Which is to say that this is not, I don't want to say it's not structured because that's not true, but I think the rabbis editing the Talmud understood that part of the human mind doesn't just work, in an outline order. We flow from idea to idea. That's part of how creativity works. And so I think you're right in the sense that they started in one place and then they start spooling up their imagination and saying, what if, right, the entire world was Jacob's ladder, the ladder he saw in his dream? And I think it leads us to interesting questions. David and then Nelson, and then I'm sorry, Sheila, you asked the question, which was, when are they doing this? I don't know. It's a great question. I'm guessing nights and weekends. David and then Nelson.
I think I can address that not from a point of view of extreme knowledge. So I have to put in the caveat that I only know this secondhand. But at least two of the sources I've looked at before in studying with one rabbi or another do suggest that not only do they have day jobs, but that they may have been doing this very early in the morning and very late at night and somehow have the energy to do their day job too, which in itself is pretty remarkable. But I guess that just leads me to reinforce where I was going before, which is that all of this seems highly speculative and impossible to really prove. But on the other hand, kudos to them for all the speculation, if we want to understand it that way, and the creativity. I think, Rabbi, was the word you used. They make you at least think. You may say, well, this is silly. Either A, who cares how wide the ladder was anyway, because that's not the point, or B, maybe the ladder was wide, maybe it was narrow, maybe it was somewhere in between. What does it say about the angels? Hard to say because it's still speculative, but it's at the same time somehow very creative, or at least thought-provoking. At least we're asking the question, even if we can't really answer it. So maybe that's the way we should look at it. I don't know. I'm just throwing that idea out there.
Yeah, and I think it would be a mistake for us to imagine these individuals as purely harsh, legal, small-minded individuals focused merely on how do we live within the halachic boundaries of life. They are creative, imaginative human beings like all of us. And this is part of Jewish tradition too, right? And I think that we can learn from them from them about this, and that it's okay for us to imagine how the universe works when we don't have an answer, right? And that's part of the learning also. Nelson, you're going to get the last word, and we're going to call it a day.
I'm a member of the county library board here in Florida, and we are very carefully schooled in the state sunshine law. And one of the things we're not allowed to do is meet each other outside and discuss library business. We can sort of like, how much are the potatoes today is okay, but if we mention a library issue, we can't do that. There's no sunshine law for these rabbis.
Definitely not. Definitely not. Dafka, they would say the opposite. You should be filling all of your time with words of Torah. And Dafka maybe when they're working, right? Okay, well, wonderful to have everybody here. Once again, and I'll drop it in the chat once again, I'll be coming a few short weeks. Class will continue as we're learning, and that weekend we'll be learning about Hanukkah and all sorts of other kinds of things. I wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom, and happy to see all of your faces, and I'll see you next week.
Yes.